This podcast is brought to you by the AlmaMAC and Scientific Canada. It was recorded on the traditional territories shared between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe nations. Enjoy. I feel like I just butchered that again, even though
That's close enough.
we just had the conversation. Okay.
My research on light adaptation in the fish right now.
I'm sitting in a kiddie pool, actually. It's quite nice,
Oh, that would be great.
but it's
man.
not very professional. It's Hello everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of the AlmaMAC. I'm Adam, and I'm your producer this week. This week's episode is a very special one. For one thing, it's the triumphant return of Sawayra Owais. For another, she speaks to a guest who studies some very important and very timely issues. I'd probably even label them as crises, really. Rida is a master's student at McMaster University. This week, Sawayra talks to her about her research, which includes assessing policy decisions from a human rights perspective. For example, stay-at-home restrictions and the homeless and unemployed, or how child welfare is affected by institutional racism. As I was editing this episode, Rida and Sawayra touched on a few things that I wasn't aware of. In particular, there's a glaring statistic that the homeless in Ontario are 5 times more likely to die from COVID-19 related complications than non-homeless. From the CBC article by Kate McGilvery, posted on January 12th, a few days before this recording, following nearly 30,000 people with a recent history of homelessness over a 6-month period, the researchers found that they were more likely to become infected with the novel coronavirus, be hospitalized, experience complications, and die. Quote, individuals recently homeless were over 20 times more likely to be hospitalized for COVID-19, over 10 times more likely to receive intensive care, and they were over 5 times more likely to die within 21 days of a positive test, said principal author Lucy Richard in an interview with the CBC Toronto. The study was conducted by the Lawson Research Institute and the Institute for Clinical Evaluative Sciences, where Richard is a research analyst. So we knew the homeless population was one of the most at-risk populations, but I wasn't aware how much worse things were for them. I wasn't particularly surprised to see that the infection rates were higher, but the difference in mortality rates was frankly shocking. This begs the question, with new lockdown restrictions in Ontario, what are we doing to help this population? Quebec and Ontario in particular have adopted these curfews coupled with hefty fines to help slow the spread among citizens, but this only really makes sense when you have a home to go to and stay in. Quebec seems to have taken a pretty horrible stance on this, issuing fines to homeless people for ignoring the curfew. From an article by Jacob Cerebrin in the National Observer, we can't force people to go stay in a shelter, Laurie Backrow said, who is a community organizer looking to end this sort of issue. We're talking about people, not objects that we can move from one place to another. Finding homeless people, she said, won't help anyone. The article goes on to say, Montreal Police spokeswoman Constable Annabelle Prato said police officers have been asked to use their judgment when dealing with homeless people who are outdoors after 8 p.m., which is the curfew time. In an email Wednesday, she said police are looking at the context for each situation and, when possible, helping homeless people access available resources. Obviously, this is not a solution, and advocacy groups are actively looking for ways to protect these people. So what about Ontario? We lagged behind on the curfew a little bit, but have recently taken up something similar to what Quebec has. However, the Ford government added the clause, "This order does not apply to individuals who are homeless." Again, obviously, this isn't going to fix the huge differences in outcomes experienced by the homeless in our communities. Honestly, I don't know what the answer is. At least we're not fining them. This is totally out of my wheelhouse. But I will share in the show notes for some of our Hamilton listeners some initiatives that you can maybe help out with. But for our guest today, Rida, this is exactly her wheelhouse. And for more on these issues and what it looks like to study them at a graduate level, stay tuned for Sawayra's interview with McMaster grad student Rida. But hey, while I have you here, have you checked out our website yet? It's at scientificcanada.ca. There you can find older episodes, videos of our interviews, and articles written by some of our contributors and guests. Some of them are actually humorous too. For example, check out the article, Twitch Streamer Awarded Full Professorship, Starts Teaching Physics. For something less humorous, you can check out Polarization, What Does It Mean for Science Communication and Decision Making, written by Sarah Turner. And if you like what you hear, we would really appreciate it if you'd recommend us to a friend. Send them to scientificcanada.ca and say, "Hey friend, check out this really great website." Now, on to the interview.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning back to the AlmaMAC here on 93.3 CFMU YouTube or wherever you're listening from. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Sawayra Owais, and it has been a while since I have been here. You may have listened on a previous episode with Adam, where I was on the other side of the mic for the very first time, and we were just talking about the trajectory of the AlmaMAC and how I am back hosting. So I'm very excited to be back, and we have a great lineup of guests and interviews, and Adam, who's preparing his little science media empire, has some great articles there as well, so make sure you check that out. But for today, I want to welcome a first-year master's student, Rida Mohsin, who is in the Political Sciences Department. How are you doing today, Rida?
I'm good. How are you?
I'm well. Thanks so much for agreeing to come on. I'm really excited to learn more about your work and your research. And why don't we just jump right into it?
Sure. Thank you for having me. I'm excited to get started.
Yeah. So, Rida, I was really intrigued reading a little bit about the work that you have done. I know you are multifaceted, so you have your hands in a lot of different places, but I think the first thing that I wanted to learn a little bit more about is, and it's actually quite topical. We were talking about this before, the work that you're doing. You're looking at how to take a human rights framework or approach when it comes to these COVID-19 response policies. Yeah, so if you can explain a little bit further, what does it mean to take a human rights approach? What does that entail in the context of the current COVID-19 responses?
So essentially, I just want to start out by saying my research is very early in its stages, so I'm not an expert just yet, but I'm going to tell you, I'm trying to cover the basics. But so basically, in terms of kind of health policy, when you take a human rights framework, you want to approach it by centering human rights in kind of the way that you create your policy. So you want to ensure that people's inalienable rights are being accounted for, and you aren't kind of foregoing them in order to justify whatever policy you're creating. And so we're seeing a lot of examples of governments using health policy or not framing policy at all in a way to harm vulnerable communities. We've seen protests with Black Lives Matter, people that are incarcerated, undocumented immigrants. So all these communities are already vulnerable, are being pushed further into the margins because of badly constructed policy or the lack of policy in general.
Right. And when I was reading a little bit more about this, I think they were saying that you need to make sure that the public health measures are necessary and adequate, but they don't go beyond what is necessary. Mm-hmm. And just how you were mentioning how there are some populations at a disadvantage. So you mentioned migrants and refugees, individuals who may be housing insecure. Are they being left out of these policies, or are these policies just not targeting the groups that really should be supported the most at this time?
I think the main concern is that they're being ignored. And so when you construct policies without having these people in these communities in mind, oftentimes you are maybe without intention criminalizing them or putting them at a place that further disadvantages them. Take, for example, the new restrictions that have been placed in this current state of emergency. We can be fined, or, you're targeted by the police. What are you supposed to do if you're homeless, or you don't, kind of have kind of stable housing? You're just going to be more in contact with the police, and it just kind of further criminalizes this huge sector of the population. Well, not huge, but large sector of the population, especially now because of growing rates of unemployment. Kind of looking at how the pandemic has kind of turn the economy upside down. You kind of have lots of more people being pushed into the vulnerable side of things.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that we see so many types of evidence and reports coming out saying that communities at a disadvantage are being disproportionately affected the most. Yet, perhaps, like again, nothing is being, not as much is done about it as could be. So I know, I'm not sure if you read it, but a recent article came out saying that individuals who are experiencing homelessness are 5 times more likely to die within 21 days of being infected with COVID-19 as compared to those who have stable housing. I think they looked at over 30,000 individuals. So, I mean, we're seeing this evidence, but still, would you say that still these COVID-19 response policies are still not taking a human rights approach? What needs to be done?
Yeah, they're really not. I think it kind of speaks to government ineptitude. At the moment, you see a lot of people, not even if you're you take in politics a lot, if you're really focused on it, just like casually paying attention, it's explicitly clear that people just don't really know what they're doing. And so when you are ignoring these communities, it's bound to harm people that you aren't taking account of. And yeah, the study you mentioned is like extremely depressing, but I think when you apply a human rights approach, you want to kind of make sure you are taking these communities into consideration, and you want to make sure that you're not constricting individual rights. You want to take in the kind of underlying detriments, such as social security, food, water, housing, and education, and you want to factor those into your like health system responses. So keeping that in mind would account for these communities. It wouldn't kind of push them further into the margins.
Mm-hmm. And just your point on constricting human rights. So again, when I was reading around this topic, it's something that I hadn't even considered. But for instance, countries that may be, or I guess you can see provinces, but countries that may be imposing things such as curfews or fines, or I think in some countries, maybe you face prison time for defying public health measures. I guess to what extent does that infringe on our inalienable human rights? And do you think those types of restrictions are effective?
So in those kind of restrictions, there's obviously human rights frameworks that take account for restrictions that would limit certain rights. But I mean, those are expected with government responses, but it depends which rights those are. If you're just using it to kind of target a community and you're further criminalizing them, it doesn't really, I mean, they can kind of justify it in their own way, but these kind of things are pretty explicit, like you've seen in the Philippines. You see in Palestine and Israel, the way their medical apartheid is going on at the moment. And so when you are creating these health policies because you aren't framing them through the human rights perspective and you're just kind of trying to constrict civil liberties, it doesn't really achieve what you're trying to do. If people think that, oh, this is like tough love, this is me just trying to do this for the greater good, but if you're further harming these people, then it doesn't really help them. It just kind of it ends up targeting people that are considered they don't contribute in the same way that other people do, and that goes into kind of biases that exist within the government and not just kind of health policy in general.
Yeah, I think, I mean, when you say something like that, I think the first thing that comes to mind is how we've responded to the crises that's been occurring in our long-term care homes. I mean, we saw it in the first wave, and unfortunately, nothing's really changed since then. And I think some of the sentiments that people, imply are that, oh, these are older adults, they're at the end of life, how much are they going to contribute to society, which is just so many different facets of ageism. But yeah, that's
you hear that from people in general too. You hear like I've heard people that I went to school with saying, it's okay if I go out and party, it's okay if I don't really isolate, I don't follow the restrictions and things because I'm young. Even if I do get it, I'll be fine. But I think it speaks to a lot of people's selfishness that you are okay with kind of spreading it in that way because you don't account for the people that are vulnerable.
Yeah, exactly. Great point. And Rida, you've also done some work and research around the intersection of child welfare and the systemic racism that may exist within it. Do you want to speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so I did this huge kind of policy project in Dr. Mordew's class. I'm not sure if you're familiar with him, but he's an amazing professor. And so I decided to look at the kind of overrepresentation of Indigenous and Black children in the child welfare system. So children's aid societies, or CAS as they're kind of known as, they derive power from the provincial government, and they essentially, have the power to remove children from their family, put them in the welfare system, and kind of decide what the best course of action is for them and their families. And so we're seeing kind of legacies of colonialism. We're seeing legacies of residential schools kind of being played out in the current system. And so you're removing these children from their families because of either biases that exist in the community, people that are doing the reporting, or biases that exist within the social workers that work for CAS. And so what happens is they're overreported, and they're taken away from their families more often than white children. White families are less kind of looked at in that way. And so it speaks more to those biases that still exist within our society, and that, that continuation of that cultural genocide that Indigenous people had to go through. And it also plays up kind of racial biases in the Black community when you don't really understand. Obviously, we have a huge immigration population here, and so if you don't understand other people's culture, you may view it as backwards or abusive. And so a lot of Black immigrants, especially from the Caribbean and the area around there, are being targeted, and they're severely overrepresented, especially in cities. In Ontario especially, it's starting to be a problem, and the rates just keep getting higher and higher, and there isn't being anything really being done just as of yet to address it.
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, I think these things really have to be placed in the historical and current context. So the ongoing colonial trauma that Indigenous peoples are facing, I've also read that they are significantly overrepresented in the welfare system, and as you mentioned, Black individuals as well. And I want to touch on a point that you mentioned earlier, saying that it could be due to biases in reporting. So do you think that maybe, I'm not sure, what are the criteria needed for a child to be taken out of their home, but do you think some of the risk assessment tools are somehow biased? You mentioned that if you're not understanding the person's culture or how they parent and their traditional parenting practices, and you only have one perspective or worldview of looking at it, obviously certain cultures are going to be left out and overrepresented. So where do you say the problem stems from? I know you discussed a few points, but where would you say the problem stems from?
I think it comes mostly from the fact that it's up to these people's discretion. So it's up to them to decide, what is okay and what is not okay. And so obviously when it's up to you and it's at the individual level, your own biases unconsciously will play into it. Sorry. And there also isn't a kind of system set up that evaluates these on a broader scale and takes these kind of considerations into account. And so another factor also is that a majority of CAS workers are white, and they always have been, and they continue to be kind of predominantly white. And so if you don't have community members, if you don't have people a part of the culture involved in these discussions, involved in, taking all these factors into consideration, you're going to have people that, just don't understand. And when you don't understand, you kind of fall into whatever stereotypical tropes you might already consider because of, whatever biases you hold. And so when you don't have that cultural understanding, you don't have that community-based knowledge, it kind of gets in the way, and you don't have a clear picture of what's going on.
And so you're talking a bit about cultural understanding, and I know there's been an increasing awareness of doing cultural safety or cultural competency training to at least reduce the biases that we may have. So would you say that is a step that we need to take to ensure that we don't keep on perpetuating these systemic racist policies that may exist within the welfare system? Is training needed, or do we need to ensure that the CAS workers are of the same culture and they understand the parenting practices, what would you say it might be needed to ensure that children remain in homes as long as they're safe?
I think CAS really needs to redirect its focus. I think it doesn't take account for the community that it polices. So having that kind of involvement is crucial. You have a lot of, Black activists and Black lawyers that have actually come out more recently and said that, this is a problem, we need to address it. So incorporating their voices is extremely important when you are looking at establishing criteria. But I also think that these kind of cultural education doesn't really give you a full picture of what you need to know when you're on the job and when you're actually face to face with these people and you're kind of faced with that culture instead of just learning about and reading about it. Because these are real people, these are real families, and there's a difference between, learning about it and actually witnessing it for yourself. So kind of having a diverse group of social workers involved in the process and having more checks and balances so that it's not so much of the responsibility isn't on the individual social worker and their discretion. Having few institutional checks on them as well to make sure that the process is legitimate and that the concerns are legitimate.
And I really like the point that you highlighted that these educational trainings, while they may be well-intentioned, like they're not going to solve the biases that may exist within individuals, workplaces at an institutional level, and nothing can really replace lived experience.
Yeah. Also, it's you could have the training and then just not take any of it in, So there's no way to kind of erase those kind of biases through a few sessions of cultural learning. It takes more than that. It takes accountability. It takes checks and balances. It takes a lot more to kind of take it all in.
And those changes that are required at a systemic level, they take time and they take effort. But I feel like sometimes if you really want change to happen, it needs to come from all levels, but I think the systems level particularly needs to be involved.
Yeah, because this isn't just a kind of focused issue here in Ontario and the CAS system. It's representative of larger systemic issues throughout government responses. But I think that the CAS system is illustrative of the kind of gap that's present in the way people approach Indigenous peoples and Black families and racialized communities, because when you are largely being policed by white people who don't have that same understanding, it's bound to kind of disadvantage you and your entire community.
So thanks for sharing all of that with us, Rida. It's really easy to see how passionate you are about these topics. I am curious, how did you light this fire under you when it comes to political science, or when it comes to investigating the racism that may exist within the child welfare system, and of course the very timely topic of the COVID-19 response policies?
So initially I started out my undergrad in criminology, and I wanted to go down kind of sociology and that kind of route. But then when Trump came on the scene, it kind of introduced me to politics in that way, and it became this huge sort of spectacle. So I kind of have to thank him for bringing me into this whole side of university and this whole kind of department. And so my research started to kind of veer into American politics, and then I started looking at Canadian politics and foreign policy, and I think a lot of it became very personal because of my identity and because of the things that I see in my own community. And so I think it just kind of appealed to me in that sense. And now doing my master's kind of showcased the practical side of things, because before then I was mostly looking at theory. And so now seeing how you can materially change people's circumstances after learning about it for so long is something that really appealed to me. And it's why policy work is probably most interesting to me, because I feel like I can actually do something about the things that are going on. So yeah, that's why I feel like my interests have really bloomed here at MAC, because a lot of the courses they're taking are a bit more hands-on. They do focus on practical approaches to all of these issues.
Yeah, it must be really rewarding to see your research being put into practice and seeing the effects of it directly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I mean, it is a bit limiting, but especially now because of COVID, can't really do field research. But I think in general, just having this experience was really fulfilling.
And you are also a faculty representative of the Graduate Student Association for Social Sciences, I believe.
Yeah, I am. Me, as well as my co-rep, Sarah. She's a PhD candidate in the anthropology department. We mostly just joined to kind of be involved in the McMaster community, especially for me because it's my first year here. I've never been to campus, and so it was important for me to kind of get involved in whichever way I could. Speaking of, I'd like to plug an event that we're having on the 28th of January. It's a grad meet and greet. It's a Zoom event for people in the grad students in the Faculty of Social Sciences, just so that we can meet each other and kind of reestablish that sense of community, especially for students like me who are here for the first time and haven't really had that side of graduate school. So it'd be nice to meet each other. Also, I think it's a good opportunity for senior students to kind of take a mentorship role and speak to newcomers and maybe give whatever advice or tips that they have for getting through graduate school.
Yeah, oh, that's so wonderful. Yeah, it's networking has kind of taken a whole new approach ever since the pandemic, but that's wonderful to hear that the GSA and the Faculty of Social Sciences is holding something like that for their students. January 28th.
Yeah, please come if you are in the Faculty of Social Science. We'd love to meet you.
Great, and we can definitely put all the links to any of that information in the show notes. And Rida, so when you're balancing all this with your research and your coursework and being a GSA representative, and this doesn't apply now, but in the before times, you really enjoyed traveling.
Mm-hmm. I did. I actually I didn't travel at all before, but then I did an exchange in Paris as part of my undergrad, and because Europe is like so cheap to travel across, I really went hardcore, and so now I'm like desperately waiting for restrictions to end and for all this to kind of be over so that I can get back to it.
And what was your favorite place, if you have a favorite one, that you visited in Europe?
Oh, I have to say Ibiza. I think I had the most fun there. I was like the laziest there. I just chilled at the beach, and it's just incredibly beautiful. And I was there with my friends. It was like the best time.
Nice. Well, we're all optimistic and hopeful that we have travel to look forward to. Maybe not in the near future, but we're getting there. Hopefully, we're getting there.
If we can all get this vaccine soon.
Getting there. Well, Rida, thank you so much for coming on the show today. It was so wonderful to hear about your really important research, and I look forward to reading more from you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me. I enjoyed it.
Okay, thanks so much. And thank you to all of you who tuned in to the AlmaMAC on 93.3 CFMU, or wherever you're listening to this on YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts from. We'll be back next week. Thanks for tuning in, folks. Take care. Before I didn't really know anything about like I mentioned the human rights framework, and then I read into it, and it was like things I didn't even consider, like curfews and surveillance, and I'm like, oh, okay, wow, like I didn't, anyway, so that was kind of cool.
Yeah,
I learned a lot.
Yeah. Thank you. I'm glad I introduced you to something new.
Yeah.